Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session this morning, this webinar, and thank you for giving us your time. I can promise you that it's going to be very fruitful. It's a big pleasure for us to be joined by the team from BMIT this morning that's going to share some of their insights with us. So as you know, we always encourage everybody to connect with the speakers on LinkedIn, go and get to know them a little bit more and their backgrounds, because it saves us a little bit of time on the webinars to actually focus on the real reason why we're here, and that's to share some knowledge with you. But it's a pleasure to have you here, Christopher Geerts, with us. Chris has been in the sector for as long as we can remember. Doesn't need much introduction, nor does Brian Nielsen, that everybody has known for so long. And also welcome to Lorraine Raby from the team from BMIT. Please visit bmit.africa, the website of BMIT. Chris, I'm sure you're going to do a little bit of a brief introduction about the company. And then we're going to delve into our topic this morning of sort of understanding and sizing the broadband market. It's a topic that is still really important to everybody. And people want to know, so what does the future investment opportunities look like? Where do we go? What can we do? How much money do we still need to go and find? And hopefully that's the question that Chris and his team is going to answer for us this morning. But Chris, thank you for your time, and thank you to BMIT for sharing this information on this platform with our delegates and our members and our network. And welcome. I'm going to hand over to you at this stage.
Thanks, Juanita, for that introduction, and thanks for having us on this webinar platform, and thanks to those attending for spending time with us. So what we're going to do is use this opportunity. Hopefully my presentation is up. Use the opportunity to size the broadband pyramid. So what we're going to do is, I've just got my team of panelists, and they can answer questions if needed, but I'll go through the presentation, give a bit of background, and then I'll explain what I'm talking about in terms of sizing the pyramid, then explain how analytics comes into the broadband problem in general, then look at how we sort of generally scope technologies for solving the broadband problem, but very briefly, and then go into an actual fiber drill down to show you the specifics around the numbers. And hopefully the infographic that we've prepared would be useful to many of you for actually using as real numbers our understanding of the current status of the South African market. And then we'll maybe touch on what could be. In other words, we've used analytics for one particular case study, but what else can one do? So I wanted to introduce you to our partner, GEOTERRA IMAGE, and we thank them for providing some very critical updated information that we use in our analysis. So they've been in business for 22 years, started in the telecoms industry, so we're turning circle here. And they've created spatial intelligence and insights for decision makers. And they also leverage Earth observation, in other words, satellites and big data, to enhance that business intelligence. They produce geospatial intelligence for 50 African countries, 300 cities. So if you're extending beyond South Africa, that might be of interest, and also 70 cities in the USA. And they provide expert data partnerships in a number of industries, including telecoms, what we're talking about today, but also in other sectors, banking, market research, agriculture, mining, town planning, and environmental. That's just to name a few. And they're part of an extensive specialist partner network, for example, ourselves. So if there's any other data that's needed or they don't have, normally one of their partners is able to provide. And their website, if you want to go and have a look at them directly, is shown on the slide. BMIT itself, we offer a variety of services. So we work in mainly the telecoms, ICT sector, but also stakeholder engagement in general. And we provide futures advisory and consulting, look at scenario planning, normally putting numbers in as well as just the overall scenario. We do, and this is our main focus area, research. So market sizing and forecasting, of which today would be an example, customer segmentation, stakeholder engagement, which includes customer and employee satisfaction surveys, as well as other stakeholders, and then product innovation research, competitive analysis, in other words, also looking at profiles and doing comparisons, and then channel research, especially in companies which have sales channels. In terms of strategy in general, we look at digital transformation strategies, market entry, as well as go-to-market strategies, marketing and brand. So quite a wide variety of strategies, including, once we've got the data, how to go ahead with your channel or partner strategy. And then this is a very important part of our business, especially with the fiber and the wireless industries being so active. When companies are investing and they need solid background data and analysis in order to justify or do due diligence on that investment, that's where we use our skills and data sets and experience. So it's market due diligences, technical due diligences, revenue assurance, regulatory due diligences, and very much a focus financial modeling and analysis and engineering analysis. And then we also get involved in policy advice. So using the information to do feasibility studies. For example, we sized the entire mobile industry with all the operators to indicate the possible impact of having a WAN or not having a WAN. So that would be the type of work and policy advice. So the question today is, can analytics assist with connecting the unconnected? And I wanted to start by just painting the picture. So this is the way we see, and probably you do too, most of you. We see the current broadband penetration market, and with a particular focus on fiber. So if you look at the pyramid on the right, you'll see there's the category A at the top. So that's where the fiber providers started, the affluent metro area, with the initial fiber to the home rollouts. Now you'll see on the pyramid we have a scale on both sides. So if I looked on the right of the pyramid, at the top you have the high income households, and then you move to the mid to low income, and then the very low income. On the left hand side we have housing density, because that relates to the cost. So the income side will tell you how much you could possibly earn from your customers, and the left side tells you how much it's going to cost to provide coverage, unless of course you're doing satellite. So the type of the ranges are mid density, then going to mid to high. So it's not a descending scale, because more of the high density actually sits in the middle part of this pyramid, and then to sparse density, which is the sort of, say, the Karoo or Northern Cape type of area, but many other areas in the country. So a lot of the action, and if I look on my table on the left, category A, a lot of the action has been in that affluent metro, but we're approaching saturation, and that's really why this topic is of importance now, because what do you do next? So we see a lot of the action now as being category B, which is one tier below the affluent metros, the middle income tier. And then that also includes the smaller towns, where you have mid to high income in those tier 2 towns and cities. As you move out of the saturation in the metro areas, there's a lot of activity, as we all know. So those, the top category would be your traditional fiber operators, Vumatel, OpenServe, Frogfoot, MFN and Octatel, for example, whereas now you have a couple of additional ones in addition to those. So that's where Heratel, Evatel, Zoom would be coming in, and Rain would also be having a play, because they're offering a 5G fixed wireless solution in some of those areas as well. So whereas the technology for the category A is active Ethernet and then largely trenched GPON, and there is also 5G fixed wireless as well as LTE fixed wireless that's taken for granted. As you move down to this level, you start to see EPON as well, particularly used by one or two operators, and then various innovations around trenching, and then aerial becoming, making this market more feasible. And that's where we see the current land grab. There is actually very much a rush to be the first to connect these areas. And the land grab also moves into this category C, which is the underserved areas, what we would call. So I've just put in brackets DSTV spenders. That's just a very loose term, meaning that many times people have estimated the market size by looking at who and where the current DSTV subscribers are sitting, and noting that represents a certain monthly spend, and could be substituted, for example, for online video consumption. So that is areas which in the early days we might have said were commercially unfeasible, but now they're very active and part of the land grab. So you have Verma Reach, you have GEOTERRA providing a big focus, OpenServe with its aerial. For example, they have many areas where they already have poles from their old copper systems, and they have access to those way leaves already. So for them, it's much more cost effective to provide access to those areas. And we've seen accelerated activity from them, for example, in that realm. Then you have Frogfoot Air, which capitalizes on using, amongst others, a single device at the house. So instead of having a cable modem, a fiber modem plus a Wi-Fi device, you integrate it and reduce the costs per household. Then there are many wireless ISPs who are providing fiber there, and there's the discussion, what we've seen in the media about Supersonic, which is part of MTN providing a wireless type service using the unlicensed spectrum, but in a particular way to provide an access service to households. And then you have Rain also able to provide 5G fixed wireless, which is closer to the fiber in terms of what you can do with it than maybe some of the LTE areas, especially around video consumption. So there you've had innovation around the trenching again, much aerial GPON and EPON, and then you've got hybrid systems. In other words, they're using fiber, but they're also introducing wireless, especially in the last mile. So access points that would serve a number of houses. And we're seeing the introduction of prepaid as well. So that's B and C is where there's a lot of action. As you move into category D, which are the areas where I sort of just loosely have described as where customers are currently buying, say, 1 gigabyte at a time in their mobile bundles. And that's not really true broadband, because you can't really do remote work, you can't watch videos, you can't study at home, you can't interact with Zoom and the like if you're at that in that category. So that's an area where it's not really feasible at the moment, but through innovation, it may result in it being feasible. We are seeing certainly operators looking at this area and trying out various solutions to move into D, but I haven't categorized it as being feasible at the moment, because it's not quite at the point where it can be exploited profitably. Then you have E, where the housing density really doesn't warrant fiber. So that will most likely remain open to wireless solutions. And that's where satellite providers, wireless ISPs, who will be in categories D and C, and then possibly with the introduction of TV white spaces more, they may be able to deeper penetrate those areas which are not really open to fiber under current technologies. So that's outside the scope of the real fiber focus. But I just wanted to point out that in terms of the number of households, as you go down this pyramid, and many of you might have read the book, bottom of the pyramid, there are many, many, many more houses. So the opportunity is there if the pricing can be cracked. So this is just to give a quick overview before I move to the fiber, that fiber is not the only technology that can be used. There are many technologies. If you look down the left-hand side, you'll see I've divided it into 4 categories. Fiber, obviously, then the 3GPP family, which is LTE and 5G. And as you probably know, there's quite an increase recently, both in South Africa and globally, in the development of the fixed wireless market around what used to be called mobile technologies, because people have realized that the current technologies allow for the much higher household consumption than the single devices used to require. So even though households need a lot more data, the technologies can now provide. Not so much in South Africa until we've had this spectrum auction, but thank you, President Ramaphosa has promised that that will happen next month. So we included this in the table nevertheless. The other aspect of 3GPP is the coverage is so much more widespread than any other technology. Then if you look at fixed wireless, there's been a very dynamic industry, and I had the privilege of being part of that very committed group who provided essential services not only in urban and rural areas. So those are the licensed wireless providers who more focus on the business and SMEs, but also far more so the unlicensed providers who've used the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz spectrum to do so much with so little. And then the introduction now of TV white spaces, which I've categorized as dynamic spectrum, dynamic in the terms of the way it's allocated. Then we have satellites, and satellites, as you know, also are making a resurgence. You've got the high throughput satellites starting to be launched now, Viasat, Eutelsat, which are bringing more like gigabits and terabits into the sky rather than megabits. And so that promises to be quite a big shakeup in the market over the years. But of course, always struggling with the inherent latency, whereas the low Earth orbiting and medium Earth orbiting, of which Starlink is the sort of iconic example because it's gone live, are starting to come on board now, and they can offer certain services where other fiber and wireless offerings are less competitive. So what I'm doing in the slide is to show that each one has a different niche position in the market. For example, if you look at CapEx, fiber has a slightly higher CapEx outlay requirement, so that's why it's red. But if you move down, you'll see some of the other technologies per household are cheaper. It's particularly unlicensed. And so you would say that unlicensed would have a particular advantage. But I wanted to point out that although this slide is very useful, and I encourage all of you to develop your own for your own circumstances, they always depend on the context. In other words, what is the reader's point of view? Is it from an operator's point of view, an investor's point of view, or a consumer's point of view, or a policymaker, or any other context? So these colors that I'm showing are not cast in stone. They can vary depending on how you interpret CapEx intensity and also what your objective is. So if you look at the one category here I've called rural, the column, you'll see most of the technologies are appropriate for rural except fiber. But that's just my point of view with the technologies at the moment and the way most fiber operators operate. And then I've just categorized the type of income areas on the right where you might see these technologies better deployed. Now, moving towards the numbers, because we promised numbers in the presentation. So the presentation is going to be shorter rather than longer, but more intensive with the numbers. So this slide is just to show a comparison conceptually, but also quantitatively between fiber deployments and LTE, for example. So on the left, if you just took a snapshot of South Africa, it soon becomes apparent that fiber really is not playing a large role in rural rollout. Whereas if you look on the right-hand side on LTE, you'll see that fiber does play a role. So these are the actual, what we believe to be the actual coverage, household coverage estimates for MTN and Telkom, who are the main players with fixed LTE commercial. We weren't able to get Vodacom, but we believe it's very similar. There's only a small percentage difference, but you can certainly see the trends. So you'll see, for example, that with the metropolitan municipality, you'll see there's high penetration of fixed LTE, whereas areas, the very few areas that are actually not covered by fixed LTE. So, for example, in the Eastern Cape metropolitan areas, it's actually quite high. If you look at the urban or local municipalities, in other words, the non-metropolitan, you'll see that there's actually very high fixed LTE penetration. So it does have a lot of promise as a broadband solution, provided especially that you can get spectrum, because fixed LTE really requires spectrum in order to sustain the type of consumption data that is really needed for watching video in particular. Now we're coming to our key slide, and this is these are the two slides which sort of we're focusing on, and going to spend most of the sort of insight time in our presentation focusing on. So if I look at this slide, these bars are all the same length, but they're shifted to the left or right, and they have different colors. And there are 10 of them because GEOTERRA Image, and we thank them for providing much of the underlying data, which combines with our understanding of the coverage. These are the GEOTERRA Image segments of income segments from 1 to 10, with 1 being the very low income segment and 10 being the high income segment. So the bars are all the same size, but let's start at the top one, which is income level 10. And you can see that the bar is shifted far to the right, which is the metro urban areas. The non-metro is on the left. And you'll see the gray area being and you could say, why is it not green? The gray area is the part that already has fiber coverage. In other words, houses that we're counting there already have fiber passing them. And that means we don't see it as much of an opportunity because it's already covered. So that's allowing for a small amount of overbuild. It's very much gray, meaning it's very much done. But there is a small portion, as you can see in the green, that's still being done, and that's what's being contested. And similarly with income level 9, you can see that it's also metro urban focused and also very covered. So 8, 9, and 10 are the areas where the current FNOs have been working very hard, mainly in the metro urban areas. So this ties back to the pyramid that I showed you earlier, looking at the actual numbers. Well, certainly our estimates, understanding of the market. Then if you look from 7 all the way down to 1 and 2, you see that there's rapidly reducing fiber penetration. So in those areas, you'll see that the true pyramid of, if you thought of a pyramid in terms of penetration, that as you go down each low, there's less and less penetration. You'll also notice when you go from 7 down that there's a much more of a shift towards the non-metro urban areas. So the small towns, for example. We haven't included rural in this because the rural fiber penetration at the moment is roughly less than 0.02%. So the only thing, if we added rural, that would change would be to add unnecessary details. So we have left out the rural parts of the municipalities. So there might be municipalities which are urban and rural. We're only looking at the urban parts of those. Then if you if you look down to income 1 and 2, you'll see that there's hardly any fiber penetration there whatsoever. In many cases, it's incidental. And incidental means it might be next to an area where fiber needed to go through in order to connect, and there might have been 1 or 2 households. Because remember, if an area is, say, category 1, it doesn't mean every person in that area is a low income person. It just means that that area has a low average income. Now, just as an aside, you might wonder why we are using GEOTERRA images data and not Stats SA. Well, it's mainly because the census is extremely outdated and a lot has happened. And it's much more useful to use updated and accurate data. And this data at the moment is from November. We're about to do a refresh, but we're showing you the November 2021 data. So compared to, say, the 2011 census, it's chalk and cheese. In fact, it's almost dangerous to use some of that data, considering that there's so many areas in South Africa which are either in decline or up and coming, or where there are shifts in population and spending. So then the next thing that we've added to this, the green, is where we think that it's readily ripe for fiber operators to go in right now and connect. So if you look from category 5 to 10, it's really worth going in there and connecting as a fiber operator and looking at that opportunity. We've chosen this based on some, because you might ask, well, why did we choose 5 and not 4 or 3? We did actually look at a particular operator that we were working with. In fact, over time, we've done it more than once. And we saw where they had connected at the moment and where they considered it feasible. And then we cross-correlated back to the data. So this is what an actual typical fiber operator now, if they looked at a suburb, would think. Yes, these are the areas where there is potential. So the green represents the readily available. Then the yellow is what we also think is based on that analysis that I said, what we also think is feasible right now. So it wouldn't necessarily be where operators are prioritizing their rollout, but if they were to look at those areas, they would say, yes, those are feasible areas. So on the metro urban area, in other words, on the right-hand side, we believe you can go down to income level 3. Whereas, and that's because the backhaul, for example, the backhaul, as one of the criteria, the backhaul costs are much lower in those metro urban areas than in the non-metro. So you have to build in extra costs. There are many other costs that also come in the non-metro, but that's an obvious one. So for the non-metro areas, we've looked at category 5 as being the cutoff for what's feasible. Then the red is what we believe currently, using current conventional aerial and trenching, is not really feasible. Now, I have to caution that we already are seeing people trying to push the limit, but using a conventional view, that's where we've done the cut. So the takeout from this slide is, if you add the areas which are green and yellow, in other words, where we think there's still potential right now for fiber deployment, we get the number of 2.83 million. So we've called it the addressable market, but what we mean is the addressable over and above the existing houses with coverage. So that's the number of households that can be addressed with current investments. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a couple of dots, and there are 4 paragraphs there. The top paragraph is the number of households that we believe already have fiber available. So that's almost 2.3 million. So that's not really as much of an opportunity unless you want to overbuild. The real opportunity comes in the next numbers, the 445,000 viable, and then the 1.83 million potentially viable. So that's really where the action is. And that's what we're saying to you at the webinar, that's what we think, that represents the market. And then on the left-hand side, just to add to those numbers, is the non-metro urban number, the 500,000 that are potentially viable in the urban non-metro areas. So that's where we get our 2.83 million. We'll take questions at the end, and I'm happy to come back to this slide if there's interest. So that was done on a normalized basis, the bars based on percentages. But if you looked at the actual numbers, you would see more of a pyramid. And if you're used to a population pyramid, you'll be used to this type of depiction. So what's important about this slide, and the reason why we added it, is because this shows where the actual numbers of households are sitting. The previous one was more about potential and percentages, but this one now shows the actual numbers. So the problem with only showing you this one is that you then see that the high income levels, 8, 9, and 10 disappear. You can hardly see any detail in those because the pure household numbers are so overshadowed by especially the category 2 and category 3 households. So if you can crack the cost conundrum, or you can work out how to provide feasible internet, you can move down into vast numbers of households. And that's why DCA, for example, as part of other initiatives, is seeking to encourage grant funding or investment funding by government into lower areas, because there's just so much enormous potential for connecting so many more houses if you can change the feasibility level and bring it down into these lower levels. And that's such an important part of any sort of policy thinking in South Africa. How can we make it feasible for operators to invest in these areas where there are so many unconnected? I'm not saying unconnected fully. In other words, they do have LTE at the moment, but not fixed connected customers. Then just looking forward at what one could do, you could take the data that we're talking about and other data, and you could mix and match it in so many different ways. So that's where we see the opportunities for using data analytics. So you can, for example, determine how much runway is left in your particular market, especially if you're investing. You know, we're doing something, we're investing, we're growing our coverage. How much further can we go using the same technology and approach? If you're wanting to grow, you can say where the best opportunities geographically and fine tune it. So you're not just doing a spray and pray approach to connecting. You can fine tune your household model. So you don't only have to use income. There are other indicators that you can use, for example, lifestyle indicators that can enrich your model. So just to give you an example of that, and the fiber operators have found this, just because a particular suburb has a lower income area than another one doesn't mean that it's not going to get higher fiber uptake, because as an obvious illustration, if it consists of young working families or single people, young working single people, they would have a propensity to use broadband, which might be higher than in a richer but slightly older neighborhood, for example. Then you can use analytics to get estimates of market shares of operators across the country without actually having to go and do all the counting yourself. You can optimize your employment based on, for example, an overbuild analysis, and we also do have an overbuild estimate per income level as well. Then you can find out how much larger the market would be, for example, and this would be speaking to what I mentioned earlier with grant or incentive funding. How much larger would the market be if deployment costs could be reduced? For example, by introducing introducing rapid deployment and make it less expensive for operators to deploy. And then also that follows the determining the impact of subsidies. So those would need additional data, and there are many types of data like lifestyle data, lifestyle measures, estimates of market share, demographics, and then other data sets, and I'll mention some of those data sets going forward. So you combine the information we've shown you with different data sets, and then you come up with new types of analytics which can help you in your planning and investment. So as a very quick example, BMIT does this digital lifestyle where we've divided households into 5 categories depending on various criteria about how they use data. And then we've segmented them. And we do actual field research. So every year we actually go out and do thousands of household studies and look at those. And we get these results. So the bottom category, digital lifestyle measure 1, is the very low broadband adopter. And we found they have particular characteristics. So here's the characteristic. They don't use TikTok much. They tend to use Facebook more. Only 9% of this category are over 12,000 on the household income. They tend to be more female, for example. Then we go through to category 3, and then if you go to the top category, you'll see there's a very different. Here you have 56% over the 12,000 mark. You have 73% of them over 25, and many more of them using, for example, TikTok. And the same for many of the other elements that I've showed there. I won't go into all the details now. This is another way of looking at the data. This also comes from direct surveys that we've done. This is how much people spend. So on the bottom axis, the x-axis, you can see the household income. And then for each household income, we've asked them how much they spend per month on internet. And you'll see very quickly that 51% of respondents spend under 300. In other words, half of the households in South Africa spend under 300. And then if you added another 100 to 499, another 200, it's another 25%. So 75% of the households are wanting to spend 500 or less, or currently spending 500 or less. And I've put a few examples on the left, and that's quite interesting of how the actual packages that are being offered by fiber operators reflect that type of pricing. Sometimes they're sitting slightly above that mark, more in the second category, the 300 to 499. But there's very much frantic selling and offering deals in that sphere, and you can see why. And looking, if you wanted more detailed data and where you'd get it from, GEOTERRA specializes in very specific data sets across multiple requirements. So on the right-hand side, going all the way through to number 8, there are different types of data sets that they have that relate to understanding the market size. So land use, demographics, population, where new developments are, lifestyle indices, both basic and enhanced, and then the current network footprint. If you then wanted to actually plan your network, you would use the data sets from 9 to 14, which are more what's on the ground, everything like towers, where the towers are, where you should put your towers, what type of coverage you would get, what footprint, your network. So that would use the height data. It uses up-to-date clutter data and includes radio frequency, for example, if you're wireless, 3D modeling of buildings. So that gives you very accurate planning support. And what they do is they take the data from certain sources. So they use Earth observation, which is really satellite imaging, and both traditional and now very enhanced machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques to glean a lot of information from those images, including trending and changing information. Then they do big data and analytics right through to cloud processing, where even big data is not sufficient. So you have very advanced analytics, and that produces the type of industry-specific outcomes. For example, telecoms, mentioned infrastructure planning, demand forecasting, looking at different regions to see how the characteristics are. Even before you move into a region, it could be even a country in Africa, you could get a very good feel without actually having to go into that area directly. Then customer segmentation and identifying site locations. For example, if you're a wireless planner, and then understanding the last mile footprint that arises from your plans. So BMIT also uses the data, and these are the type of areas: industry trackers quarterly, strategic planning, doing deep dives and looking at, I'll only really focus at the top right, which is your investment business cases. So that's to support investment decisions or strategic decisions based on real data that you can support. The board members or the investment houses tend to appreciate that independent view. So that's my presentation. I'll thank you for the opportunity. Let's keep connecting those areas. If you want a copy, I've given you the email there. And I have my two panelists that are on the call as well. And I'll hand it over to Juanita to take questions, which the panelists can also answer questions on.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think there's a lot of food for thought around what's what the future looks like and where we're going to go. I just wanted to sort of touch a little bit on what you mentioned about some of the work that's happening at national government level, while we see whether there are some questions coming in. So government have in the last I think in late 2020 started consulting with private sector companies, really seeking to understand what it would take for private sector to deploy deeper into the network. So to not stop in a particular area, but to continue their deployment. And there was extensive consultation that had taken place with many of the CEOs from the sector to understand what a particular, what that particular price point would look like. And subsequently, they've gone away and they have indicated that that National Treasury have approved a fund, what's called a Broadband Access Fund, and to our knowledge, they're right now busy just with defining the legal mechanisms for the distribution of that fund. It looks at this stage like any ECNS licensee will be able to apply for that funding. And then, they would have to prove a couple of things like, it is an area that they typically would not have deployed, if it was up to them. And then there will be an amount that would be made available depending on the backhaul requirements, etc. So we know that they're busy with the technical crafting of that mechanism to just understand what that looks like. It's really exciting because we believe that that could turn the needle. We know that they've spoken about as the first phase, they've identified 50,000 households as a proof of concept. As with anything in government, there's always a proof of concept. They won't just throw a lot of money at just anything. But we know that they said that if it is successful, then they will potentially look at connecting another 6 million people as a second phase, and potentially another 6 million, so ultimately 12 million people. Whether that's realistic and the timelines associated with that, we don't know, but we'll see. So time will tell. I don't see any particular chat other than for people asking for the actual presentation. Chris, I don't know if you've got a question that you wanted to pose for either Brian or for Lorraine on this as a side, but
well, I can ask if my colleagues have anything to add that I maybe have not covered in sufficient detail or
I see that
glanced over.
Alden Lala from American Tower Corporation says, on this slide with LTE indicating or showing the LTE coverage, is that percentage of geography or percentage of people covered?
Yes, that's a good question. That's the households. So we took the GEOTERRA image household information, and what we do is we use enumerator areas. So the country is divided by Stats SA into enumerator areas. We look at the household numbers in each one, and then we take a sample in that area to see whether it's got fixed LTE, not LTE, but fixed LTE in that area or not. And so it's done at that level. If we do detect fixed LTE, then we have a yes, and if we don't, then it's a no.
Then Louise Pillay from Investec asks, which solution offers a better return on investment? Fixed wireless access versus fixed LTE and fiber, and how does this compare in rural versus urban areas?
I'm happy to answer that. Brian, do you want to make a comment?
I think you should take it, Chris.
Okay, so it's comparing fixed wireless as in traditional fixed wireless with LTE. All right, so yeah, it's difficult to say which gives you a better return. I guess it depends, what you're doing with it. But if you go into an area where there's poor coverage and you want to cover that area, quite rapidly, then the unlicensed spectrum operators have done a very good job. They have a relatively low capex outlay and they get the return fairly quickly. But then as the demand goes up, customers are soon wanting, to increase their connections, and that requires additional investment and maybe migration to other technologies. But certainly we've seen Herotel, which is prepared to go into those areas where the fixed wireless is best suited, as an example, doing extremely well because they understand those markets and they understand both the technologies and the communities that they're serving. So, and that does give a very good return on investment. Generally, the wireless ISPs get let's say a fast return. The LTE and 5G is incredibly expensive to outlay. So it's a different game. But if you've got good spectrum at the moment, yeah, you could get a good return. The market is incredibly competitive, so you just would have to be with someone who's got deep pockets that can handle the competitive nature, and you'd really have to have, in South Africa anyway, a really good game plan to segment and understand your market. Otherwise, you might come across headwinds with the existing operators. But if you're going to a country, for example, in Africa, where there might not be good coverage, and you didn't have as much intense competition, you might make a really good return because you've got more greenfield coverage. There's this huge pent-up demand, and the technologies are coming down in price quite nicely because of the opening of the technology from vendor specific to open standards. So I don't know if that answers adequately. I think you need to know the specific situation.
Yeah.
If you look at the operators
it's
that
very,
are coming
very unique to the area.
Yes, so the existing, in the bid for spectrum, you've seen that there are no new entrants that thought that it was worth applying for spectrum from scratch with the upcoming auction. Whereas for the wireless open access network, there were far more potential applicants, and they felt that was more profitable. But it is quite a marginal business in South Africa, and it depends on many factors. So you would have to go in with your eyes open if you were investing in the WOAN. It is possible, and you could make a lot of money, but you'd have to make sure you had a whole lot of things in place before you could make that money.
Chris, just two final questions. One is from Tim Paul from City of Cape Town, asking how we're doing compared to other developing nations in terms of working down the pyramid. And then Vincent Kabunga from the IEEE Africa Councils asking, have you done a similar study beyond South Africa?
I'll answer the second one. We don't do this type of in-depth study. You know, this is far more detailed and requires, from our side, a thorough understanding of the markets, you know, and the individuals. So we do more secondary research in other countries, and when we do primary, it's more interviews combined with local data, which is often not as easily accessible. But I mean, the potential is definitely there. We've looked at about 3 countries ourselves in slightly more detail, but not to this level of detail. If I could answer, greetings, Tim. If I could answer Tim Powell, countries vary a lot. In Africa, you have a couple that are progressive with the regulatory regimes, and that makes a huge difference in unlocking investment and going forward. So if you know, Kenya, for example, in Rwanda, if you have a on-the-ball regulator, you can really see advances quite significantly. But if you if there are any sort of blockages, then that tends to bring developments to a halt. So generally in Africa, they're more sitting at 3G than LTE in terms of most of the countries. So there's still quite a lot behind. And the recent pandemic just highlighted that even though you might have many, on paper, many customers covered in a number of African countries, in general, the type of coverage wasn't sufficient for the broadband that we're talking about, where you can actually do remote activities. So it was found to be severely wanting, and it's been a wake-up call. But you do have pockets of difference, like, you know, fiber penetration in Nairobi, for example, where they are going ahead. But I would say we're not far behind, and partly because we've just got so much more disposable income in South Africa than most of our neighbors. If we took Africa, if you take other, you know, Asia, then it's very different. We could be well behind a number of countries. We just move so much quicker.
Yeah, we're faring a little bit behind, you know, other countries. But I think, Chris, I want to just pick up on what you said, because it also depends on sort of government interventions. We're seeing in the UK massive amounts of money being pumped into reaching underserved areas and grants being made available. The US government have just approved more than $42 billion to deploy broadband infrastructure into lower income areas. So of course that changes the picture completely. But you know, we have to accept that in South Africa, we'll more than likely it's going to rely heavily on private sector, and although we'll see some form of a government enabling the sector through things like policy reforms and making way leaves easier accessible, like we see the president spoke about last night, the work of Operation Vulindlela, you know, that's crafting the way leave bylaws, the physical bylaws that, and in fact, we've got a session, I think next week or the week thereafter, bringing the sector up to speed on what those bylaws look like. It will still have to rely on private sector to deploy that, and as long as it does and there's no other incentives, you know, the pyramid is likely to you know, look the way that it does.
Yeah,
which is also going to drive the market consolidation. I was on a call this morning about the Vodacom CIVH acquisition in an investment conference, and we can expect that there's going to be some consolidation still.
Yep, and you touched on an important point. I mean, if you look at developing countries, often we are ahead. But if you look at developed countries, but the unserved areas in those countries, there's just so much more happening in Europe and the States. The governments are proactive. They're providing that grant funding, which makes all the difference. You know, they're dividing the areas up in a more proactive way. and you have these open access fiber networks that are really thriving in Western Europe, Italy, Germany, Spain. All those countries have really successful, even the open access networks focusing on the rural areas in those countries, and partly with the grant funding, but not entirely. And you even have, like in France, examples of profitable networks which no longer need the grant funding. There was available, but they've learned how to actually move beyond that. So that's where I've looked to for a lot of examples of what could be done in South Africa.
Yeah. So just in closing, a very good colleague and friend of mine, Chidi, I haven't spoken to you in a while. I hope all is well in Nigeria. Has posted a question. He says, given the incredibly high bid costs for most 4 or 5G spectrum, is there a clearer path to fiber to the home ROI in dense urban areas? Most open access FTTH operators seem to struggle with monetization.
Sorry, who struggles with monetization most?
The operators, FTTH, so FNOs, fiber network operators.
Yeah. Struggle with monetization in the dense areas. I thought.
Yeah. So I think what Chidi is saying is that, is the case for 4G, 5G not a better, well, I don't know, given the incredibly high cost for most 4 or 5G spectrum, isn't there a clearer path to FTTH ROI in urban dense areas?
Well, yes, and that's what's. So first of all, many countries are providing access to spectrum beyond the big operators. So the idea of making community spectrum available or alternative spectrum, but not so much in the dense urban areas, but certainly in the rural areas, is a fantastic idea and really needs to be pursued and makes all the difference. And now with modern technologies, there's a lot one can do involving communities or entrepreneurs in rural areas, and even in rural areas, but even in urban areas, that technology can often, innovators can often use that spectrum more effectively if they're given access to it, even if it's on a localized basis. The answer really to me on where the fiber marginality ends is either to provide grant funding, or there needs to be further development, and there is development in the hybrid models of fiber plus wireless. And part of it is technology, and part of it is perception. If you can persuade people that a fiber to an area with wireless spokes or coming out is just as good, then you can really go far. And that's what MTN Supersonic was trying, and in other countries it's been done. And to me, that would solve problems right across Africa, and many operators are looking for that type of solution. And many of the FNOs in South Africa are looking at that as well. In fact, some are even deploying areas using that, where the fiber doesn't go right into every house. It only has to go nearby to a house, and then the last mile can be wireless. It's perfectly good for that requirement. The one last thing I'll say that just pulls into that is that by far, and this is other research, by far the most requirement is for 10 megabits links rather than 50 or 100. So even though there's growth in those areas, people are very happy with 10 and 20. And that isn't very demanding on most technologies nowadays. So you can actually do a lot more with low cost technologies than one would think. And you don't have to think about the gigabit future. You only have to connect those houses now. Because even on the fiber networks, that's what people are actually asking for. Yeah,
right. And I mean, once the glass is in the ground or in place, I mean, you can always upgrade at a later stage. But yeah, it's to get the initial demand. Thank you very much, Chris, and the team from BMI, as well as Lorraine. Thank you very much for your time today. Very informative session. The presentation will be shared. Chris, I'm not sure if you want to send it to Risha and she sends it out. If you did post your email address, or how you want to do it.
I posted a address there in communications@bmit.africa.
Okay, great. If
Um,
everybody can just drop a message there, then Chris will share the presentation with you. And yeah, but thanks everyone. Thank you for your time. It's now afternoon on Friday officially, so a couple of hours to go, and then we can all go and have a weekend, hopefully. Again, Chris, thank you very much for sharing those insights. Phenomenal session. Really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.